It's late at night in Chicago, and a police car is speeding toward the hospital after one of the officers was shot. He is immediately rushed into surgery, and the staff contacts Paul, the best surgeon in the hospital. He asks another doctor to finish and rushes to see the cop, but it's too late. The officer has already died. The following morning, Paul has breakfast with his wife Lucy and their daughter Jordan, who has been accepted to college in New York. After that, they leave for Jordan's soccer game, where Paul and Lucy are very supportive of the girls. However, there is a father who is constantly irritated by every detail and yells angrily. Paul politely asks him to shut up, and the man becomes enraged, resulting in an argument that quickly escalates into the man attempting to become violent. Lucy interrupts and takes Paul away, prompting the man to call him a chicken. After the game, the family visits a pizza restaurant with Paul's brother Frank. Paul agrees to lend Frank $2,000. Frank teases him about his salary, which is overheard by the valet Miguel. He also learns that the family will be away tonight, so when he arrives to pick up the car, he takes a photo of the address on the car's sat-nav. In the evening, the family prepares to go out to celebrate Paul's birthday, and they give him a fancy new watch. However, Paul receives a call from the hospital and is forced to go to work, postponing the celebration. Lucy and Jordan go grocery shopping instead, and when they get home, there's a suspicious van parked around the corner. Jordan goes upstairs to call her girlfriend, while Lucy is in the kitchen baking a cake for Paul, unaware of an ominous figure behind a door. Lucy suddenly notices that her cookbook has changed pages due to a breeze from the window, which is supposed to be closed. When she goes to close it, she finds muddy footprints on the floor. Lucy yells for Jordan to come downstairs when she realizes someone has broken in, but a robber has already hidden in her bathroom and apprehends Jordan as she attempts to leave. Jordan is then taken downstairs, where 3 criminals threaten to kill him if Lucy does not cooperate. The leader then takes Lucy to the safe, forcing her to open it and place all of the family's valuables in a bag. In the kitchen, one of the robbers warns his partner not to play with the knife and orders him to put it down before heading outside to look for a rope. Now that they are alone, the knife guy uses the opportunity to harass Jordan, only to be interrupted when his friend returns with the rope. He tells the other thief to stop because they haven't crossed that line, and an argument ensues. Jordan takes advantage of the thief's distraction by grabbing his knife and cutting his face, causing the other guy to hit her and throw her to the ground. Lucy returns with the 3rd robber, and when she sees the commotion, she grabs a pot of boiling water and throws it at one of the robbers before telling her daughter to run. However, the criminals have had enough and start shooting. Paul is in the middle of surgery at the hospital when he overhears the intercom announce the arrival of 2 female patients. He waits for his co-worker to finish this one before rushing to help, but the other doctors refuse to let him work on it. By the time they finally explain what's going on, Lucy has died and Jordan is in surgery. Despite his skepticism, Paul goes to check on the body and is horrified by what he finds. After that, Detectives Rains and Jackson question Paul and compile a list of all the items stolen from the safe. Frank also arrives and shouts at the police officers for not taking the recent crimes in the area more seriously, but Paul tells him to calm down. The detectives try to reassure Paul that they will find the culprits. At that point, a nurse announces that Jordan has survived surgery but is still in a coma, and Paul remains by her side. Later, Lucy's father, Ben, speaks at her funeral. On their way back, Ben comes to a halt in the middle of the road to inspect something on the ground. Ben, furious for some reason, gets back into the car and rushes to his property, where 2 poachers begin fleeing. Ben gets out and begins shooting at them, but they flee. Paul is shocked, but Ben says they can't rely on the police because they only arrive after a crime has occurred. He believes that sometimes men must take matters into their own hands, so he shoots the deer that the poachers injured to put it out of its misery. Later, while driving and talking on the phone with Rains, Paul is disappointed to learn that no suspects have been identified. His bad mood leads him to yell at a homeless man who is attempting to clean his car window. After that, he goes to see Jordan and finds her girlfriend reading to her, and Paul is relieved that his daughter has support. As the days pass, Paul begins to attend therapy. He discusses how he is unable to sleep in bed and instead sleeps on the couch. He also recalls his unhappy childhood, which included riding trains alone to avoid his father. So he started doing the same thing just to think. Every suspicious guy on the street reminds him of the men who kidnapped his wife, and he regrets that he failed to protect his family. The therapist assures him that healing is a process that will require time. He spends his days reading to Jordan, riding trains, and attempting to hang out with Frank, but mostly he sits on the couch, depressed. Eventually, he becomes more understanding and pays the hobo to clean his car windows. Weeks pass, and Paul has yet to receive any updates on the case, so he visits Rains in person. He questions the detective about the DNA samples, which did not match anyone in the database. Rains's office has a board with all of the open cases he is currently working on, and only a small percentage of them have been resolved. demonstrating a lack of resources to properly address them all. Later that evening, as Paul was leaving the train station, he noticed two men harassing a young woman. He tells them to leave her alone, but the guys get angry and beat him up instead, though at least the girl gets to run away. When Paul gets home, he watches television and notices an advertisement for a local firearms retailer that makes an impression on him. The next day, he visits that retailer, and the shop assistant shows him all of the different weapons they have. However, he has to fill out a lot of paperwork and take a gun safety class, not to mention the security cameras everywhere. So he says he'll think about it. Sometime later, Paul is in the hospital, treating another gunshot victim. When the body is moved for surgery, a gun falls out of the patient's pocket, so Paul kicks it under the operating table to retrieve it later, hiding it in his clothes. When Paul returns home, he attempts to shoot the gun for the first time, but the bullet bounces, making him realize he needs to learn more. Paul spends the next few days of his free time watching gun tutorials and learning how to use the gun. After much practice, his aim improves enough. One day, Paul is called to the ICU and discovers Jordan has had a seizure. Her condition worsens, and it is unlikely that she will survive. When Paul notices that her body has been strapped to the bed for safety, he becomes enraged because his daughter is in handcuffs, but not the criminals who committed the crime. His sanity finally failing, Paul waits until nightfall to take the gun and begins walking through a rough neighborhood of Chicago while hiding his face with a hoodie. When he sees two men attempting to steal a woman's car, he confronts them, but they jump into the vehicle and shoot at him. As Paul rolls over to avoid the bullets, the criminals drive away, but Paul recovers quickly and shoots the driver, causing them to crash. A piece of glass falls off, injuring Paul's hand. The other guy gets out of the car and begins shooting blindly, so Paul hides behind a car and waits for the right moment to shoot him in the head, unaware that a woman at a window is filming the entire scene. After firing a second shot and telling the victim to flee, Paul leaves the scene, throwing his hoodie in the garbage before boarding the train. When he gets home, he uses his medical knowledge to treat his own wound before going to sleep. He keeps having dreams about what he did, but the therapist's medication helps him sleep. Moments later, Rains and Jackson arrive to take statements. The woman who was almost robbed is extremely grateful, but the person who recorded everything believes he was cold and brutal. Unfortunately, Paul's face is not visible in the video, but the woman has already shared it online. The detectives also watch it and notice that the shooter has injured his hand. The next morning, Paul sees the video of himself and is impressed by his own actions, so the guilt that had caused nightmares fades. The video quickly goes viral, and the media begins to debate whether what he did was wrong or not, given that he saved a life while also acting as a vigilante. This fame earns him the moniker, the Grim Reaper. At the hospital, Paul wears bandages on his hand to make it appear smaller, and whenever cops approach, he hides his hand in his pocket. In the afternoon, he helps a young boy who has been shot by a local criminal. By being gentle and understanding, he persuades the boy to admit he was shot by a dealer known as the Ice Cream Man. He also obtains his address from the chart. After work, Paul steals a hoodie from the hospital laundry and heads to the boy's sketchy neighborhood, where he discovers the Ice Cream Man relaxing on the street. Paul wastes no time in shooting the man before fleeing, and the locals seize the opportunity to steal everything from his small cart. Moments later, the detectives arrive at the scene and hear more stories about a man in a hoodie. Rains notices some kids reenacting the shooting and notices the boy is using his left hand. After comparing it to the viral video, he concludes that it was most likely the same The Grim Reaper from the previous time. The next thing Paul knows, the media is going crazy because the Grim Reaper has attacked again, and he watches the news with pride. At the police station, the superior yells at the detectives for allowing a vigilante to go around shooting criminals, fearing that others will follow suit. The only clues they have are that the shooter is left-handed and does not handle weapons well. Meanwhile, Paul attends another therapy session, and the therapist tells him he looks a lot better and should keep doing what he's doing. Some days later, Paul is operating on another gunshot and is surprised to discover it is Miguel. He also notices a watch on his wrist. Paul's attempts to save him are ineffective, and Miguel dies on the operating table. Then Paul seizes the opportunity to go to the ambulance and steal Miguel's phone, which he unlocks with Miguel's cold finger. After taking his watch, Paul hides in his office and begins looking through Miguel's photos, becoming disgusted when he sees a photo of the inside of his car. He digs a little deeper and discovers a photograph of a liquor store that is actually a front for selling stolen merchandise. Paul considers calling the detectives, but ultimately decides to conduct the investigation himself. When Frank comes to see him, Paul cancels his plans and attempts to divert his brother's attention away from the wound on his hand. In the evening, Paul picks up another hoodie from the hospital laundry and goes to the liquor store, where he fabricates a story about being Miguel's friend. However, the owner notices the hospital label on the hoodie and secretly texts another criminal named Fish, instructing him to come over. The man then reaches for a revolver, But Paul notices this in the mirror and quickly nails his hand with a bar dart before demanding to see all of the stolen items he resells. Held at gunpoint, the owner leads Paul to a safe in the back where he discovers all the valuables stolen from his home. Fish arrives at this point and attempts to shoot Paul, but he sees him on the security cameras and dodges, resulting in the owner's death. Fish opens fire on Paul, forcing him to hide to reload his gun. When Fish slips on the blood, Paul grabs a guitar and hits him with it before pushing some furniture across the floor. Fish dodges just in time and returns to the bar, but Paul uses the cameras to shoot him in the leg, knocking him down. Then he steps on Fish's leg and asks who killed Lucy, to which Fish responds that it was a mechanic named Joe, whose address he has on his phone. As Paul picks up the phone, Fish kicks him to the ground, knocking him into a shelf. Fish then stands up and aims his gun, but a bowling ball falls from the shelf and knocks him down, allowing Paul to shoot him with his own gun. Paul then quickly grabs the security hard drives and leaves, but his ring falls to the ground on his way out. When he gets home, he watches a video to learn how to destroy the drives using a drill. The following day, the media goes crazy over the Grim Reaper, and anyone who saw him goes viral. At the hospital, Paul steals some syringes and medicine, and Rains and Jackson pay him a surprise visit. They show him a picture of Fish in the ring, which Paul confirms is his. The detectives believe the ring was also stolen, so they only came to give Paul the good news, which allows them to finally move the case forward. After they've left, Paul destroys Fish's phone. Later, Paul goes to see Joe. He sneaks into the shop while Joe is underneath a car and surprises him by knocking him out with a wrench. Joe awakens to find himself tied under the car, and Paul begins torturing him in order to extract information. After giving him an injection, he makes a deep cut and then pours brake fluid on the wound, causing excruciating pain. After much suffering, Joe explains that the man who killed Lucy was named Knox, but no one goes to him. Instead, you wait for him to come to you. Paul thanks Joe for the information and releases him, but on his way out he pulls on a chain, causing the car to fall on top of Joe, killing him. The detectives pay Frank a visit the following day. They've realized that all of the men the Grim Reaper is killing are the ones who murdered Lucy, so they want to see his hand. Meanwhile, Paul is in the hospital visiting Jordan and learns from the news that copycats are already killing people using the Grim Reaper story. At that point, Paul receives a call from Knox, who asks him to meet at a club in 30 minutes. While Paul leaves for the club, Frank goes to Paul's house and lets himself in when no one answers the door. When he enters the basement, he notices all the ammunition and signs of Paul's depressed life, and he realizes he is the Grim Reaper. Paul goes to the overcrowded club and texts Knox that he is there. Knox tells him to meet in the bathroom, so Paul goes there and calls Knox's cell phone. Following the ringing of the phone, he kicks open a stall only to discover a phone. Knox appears from behind at this point, and while using a civilian as a shield, he begins shooting non-stop, killing random people with no regard for their lives. Paul is also injured and hides in the stall while shooting, injuring Knox in return. Then he shoots the power box, and as the lights go out, he blends in with the panicked crowd to flee. Moments later, the detectives receive a call about the club shooting and proceed to the hospital, where one of the victims claims to have seen the shooter. This victim is Knox, who provides numerous details and leads the detectives to Paul's office, but he is not present. Meanwhile, Paul hides in another hospital room and uses glue and a stapler to treat his latest wound, which is extremely painful. Then he returns home and finds Frank there, who confronts him about how insane he has become. Paul justifies his actions by claiming that no one else would do them. The detectives ring the doorbell, interrupting their conversation, so Frank answers the door and informs them that Paul is not present. The detectives do not believe him, but they are unable to proceed without a warrant and must leave. At this point, Paul receives a call from the hospital informing him that Jordan is awake. He rushes there and, after a warm reunion with his daughter, has to inform her that her mother has died, causing Jordan to have a breakdown. Now that Jordan has recovered, Paul promises Frank that he will no longer be a vigilante. A week later, Jordan is finally allowed to return home, and the detectives arrive to question her, but she has no recollection of the night of the attack. When she and Paul enter the elevator, Knox joins them, but Paul ignores him for safety. Knox makes small talk with Jordan, and as they leave, Knox says he'll see them around. Seeing this as a threat, Paul returns to the gun store and purchases some weapons legally. Later in the evening, Jordan prepares for bed after dinner, but Paul notices something outside and tells her to go under the stairs and dial 911. At that point, a man enters through the back door and heads to Paul's room to shoot the figure on the bed, but it's only pillows. Another henchman follows the sound of a running shower, but it's a trap, and Paul shoots him in the head. When the first guy arrives to check on him, Paul is hiding next to the body and quickly shoots again, knocking the guy to the first floor. Then Paul hears a noise in the basement and goes down, but Knox surprises him and shoots him in the shoulder, causing him to fall onto the couch. At that point, Jordan emerges from the stairs and screams, distracting Knox. Paul seizes this opportunity to press a button on his table, revealing a hidden weapon that he uses to finally kill Knox. When the cops arrive, Paul tells them that he sustained all of his injuries tonight and that he obtained all of his weapons legally after Jordan awoke to protect her from being hurt again. He also says he'll surrender his weapons, implying he's done being a vigilante. The detectives don't believe him, but they're pleased with the results and decide to let the case go. Later, Paul drops Jordan off at college in New York City, where her girlfriend has already arrived. As he heads back to his car, Paul notices a man steal a bag from a bellhop's cart and can't help but call him out while pointing a finger gun at him.
I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next video.